Well, actually, speaking of problems and customer journey and understanding what's going on, like things like risk, that wasn't a very good segue.
That was fine, Dirk, come on.
Okay, risk management continues to be a major topic for our readers, Quality Digest readers, and actually also our webinar attendees. And as such, we try to keep putting that topic, risk management, in front of you on, I don't know, almost a weekly basis, or at least 2 or 3 times a month, 4 times a month, there's an article that's somehow related to risk management. This week, for example, we ran the article Applying Risk-Based Thinking to Operations by Tim Lozier of ETQ. And as usual, there will be a follow-up webinar that will provide even more detail on that topic. We'll get to that in a little bit. But joining us right now via Skype today to talk about a risk-based thinking in operations and some other risk stuff is longtime contributor Tim Lozier of ETQ. Hi, Tim.
Hey guys, how are you?
All right, pretty good. Okay, before we get into operational risk management, which is really what the webinar and your article about, there's a couple things I'd like to hear about first, just to kind of get the information out there. A standard we hear about quite frequently is ISO 31000 risk management. Just briefly, what is ISO 31000 and what is its importance?
Well, guys, the ISO 31000 standard is actually the overview of risk management in general, and what it of how you go about identifying, treating, and assessing risks and controlling them. And it's a standard that you may not necessarily adhere to on its own, but you're finding that it's creeping up in a lot of other standards component, maybe not explicitly, such as ISO 1, ISO 135, 13971, various others. So what it's seeing is that the 31000 standard, while a broad overview, is something that a lot of companies can use as a baseline for building risk management in their operations.
Okay, your mic started to drop out there a little bit. I think we got most of that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the ideas that you mentioned, and we can kind of get to it a little more explicitly maybe, are those ideas completely encapsulated in ISO 9001 and other QMS management systems?
Not specifically, but they are brought up in many ways. So, the ISO 9001 is very broadly stated around risk-based thinking, and, they don't really outline the 31000 standard, but what you're finding is a lot of the best practices that are creeping up in standards like ISO 9001, you're actually seeing in 31000. There's a lot of commonality there. The process is very similar in many ways.
Okay, so briefly then, what is operational risk management? Is this, I don't know, an actual thing, or are you simply kind of breaking out operations as one place to focus your risk management efforts?
Well, when you look at the context of risk management as a whole, it can encapsulate many different things. So, while risk management can cover governance and compliance, it can cover financial risk, what operational risk management seeks to do really is to look at the context of your business processes, what you're doing within those processes, and build in risk components to that. So whether you're conducting audits, you're doing complaints, you're doing corrective actions, training, whatever it may be, operational risk management seeks to add a component of risk to the daily operations that you're doing and how those processes incorporate risk into them.
Okay, now you indicate in your article that risk is a moving target, that it's subject to change based on maybe more data that comes in on processes or maybe even changes in the operation. So that would seem to me that assessing risk is almost a full-time job, right? I mean, if things are always changing and you're always having to assess risk based on those changes, how do you keep up with that? How do you address that?
Well, I wouldn't say that it's necessarily a full-time job, although depending on the industry that you're in, depending on how much oversight you have, how much regulatory compliance needs you have, you may want to spend more time with it. What I think a lot of companies are either struggling with or they're looking to get clarity on is, how do I apply risk-based thinking to what I'm doing already? And I think that's something that companies are trying to find their way around. And really what risk allows you to do is to not re-engineer your entire processes, but to really add another component that's more quantitative in nature and provides a decision-making factor based on that results. And what ends up happening is you have now a cycle, like you would in a continuous improvement cycle. You have a cycle that you would look to seek to find new risks or find new ways. And I think a lot of companies who want to learn more about that need to understand how risk can be incorporated into your existing business process, which is something we're going to be talking about next week in the webinar.
And we want to talk about that in a minute. But before we get to that, Tim, I want to ask you a quick question. So, we're all concerned about obviously knocking down silos and getting rid of them within our organizations. But, operations and quality are oftentimes considered to be in silos on their own. So, risk is one that really would span interests from people in both areas. So how do you get people talking across those two platforms at each other, maybe using risk as the opportunity to have those conversations?
Well, what I think risk does in general, what the beauty of risk and the power of risk is that it really levels that playing field. It's almost a universal translator. So people in operations may not speak quality, people in quality may not speak operations, but everybody speaks risk. So if you're able to quantify the processes that you're doing, whether it's through general quality assurance or it's through production, it's through supply chain, if you can boil it down to a risk management level, or what is the risk, then you can have a conversation and really build a better culture of compliance, a culture of communication, and really tear down those silos, in effect, through risk.
Okay. Well, if you're interested in learning more about this topic, Quality Digest is hosting a webinar with ETQ and Tim Lozier here, titled Applying Risk-Based Thinking in Your Operations, Tools and Tips for Incorporating Risk into Quality Management. It's coming up on Thursday, July 13th at 2 p.m. Eastern, 11 a.m. Pacific. Tim, as I said, will be presenting and I'll be your host. So you can click on the registration link in Tim's article, or there's also a link underneath the player page that'll take you out to the webinar registration page. So Tim, thanks for joining us this morning, and we'll be talking to you next week on Thursday.
Okay, guys, thanks. It's been fun.
Tim.
Thanks, Tim. We'll see you then.
All right.